call it financial injustice. I think that is what it should be called. It's unjust to deny a woman a loan because she doesn't have collateral.
Well, hello everybody. I don't know about you, but I found that last panel discussing how to protect vulnerable women from trafficking incredibly moving. And we're going to look at another issue now to do with how to protect vulnerable women in a very, very different context, which is the question of money, finance, giving women power through access to financial means. And joining me for this discussion are two fascinating people, Ajay Banga, who is the CEO of Mastercard, and Kristalina Georgieva, who is the CEO of the World Bank. The first woman, I think, to hold that position. Am I right?
The first person to be in this position. Yes.
That's terrific. And by the way, I'm Gillian Tett. I'm the US Managing Editor of the Financial Times.
Gillian, just to be clear, I'm the first guy who looks like me to do my job.
And picking up that he for she theme that's so eloquently been articulated by people like Emma Watson, it's great to have a man on the panel surrounded by all these powerful women talking about female inclusion. So, welcome, Ajay. Now, in some ways, it's quite interesting to have you both on the panel talking about this issue, because if you dial back a decade or two ago, the World Bank has always been on the side of the angels, if you like, when it comes to trying to defeat poverty, or at least that's part of its mission. But Mastercard and the financial sector haven't always been on the side of the angels. So let's be honest about this. I mean, think about the recent financial crisis, think of the collapse of confidence in many financial service companies. You know, I think many people in the audience will be sitting here thinking, well, what on earth can a credit card company, which is in this to make money, to make profit, actually do to actually help women help combat poverty? So, Ajay, you have 30 seconds to convince us that you can be a force for good.
So first of all, we're not a credit card company. We're a technology firm, and we use technology and data. The banks issue the cards, we don't.
Okay,
so that's
right.
the first thing.
So why are you here? What are you doing with the World Bank to try and talk?
My belief is that if you think about the world's full of networks. What makes you succeed is your network. It could be a job network, an educational network, a financial network. When you don't have access to financial services, 2 billion people around the world don't. And by the way, the majority of them don't even have an identity. And an identity is kind of fundamental for you to be counted, for you to mean something, for you to be able to vote in most countries, and a few states in the United States after a few, 6-8 months back. So the issue really is, if you don't have a network, you're left out. We're trying to get them into the digital network. Majority of these 2 billion people who are unbanked are women. And that kind of has all kinds of implications for poverty and economic sort of independence. And that means social independence. So that's kind of one set of segments. The other part is, there's this refugee crisis around the world where there's 100 million people living in refugee camps. They live there for 15 to 17 years. If they don't have an identity and if they don't have access to basic needs, not just food and water, but they're going to be there 15, 17 years. They need jobs, they need commerce, they need stuff. That doesn't happen if you're excluded.
So how are you trying to work with groups like the World Bank to deal with these issues?
The biggest issue is that if you, first of all, as a private sector company, you've got to make this part of your business model. And the reason I believe that is I believe there's not enough money in philanthropy and the government sector to solve this problem. Business has to step up and make this part of its business model so it makes sense to you and your investors. And that's what we're trying to do. We have technology, we have the capability, we really care. I know that our employees care. It matters to them.
So what are you tangibly doing? And then I'm going to ask Kristalina. What are you actually tangibly doing to help? I mean, you're not going around giving out, credit cards to everyone. I mean, how are you?
Although we do give cards out, but I'll tell you what we do. I'll give you a couple of examples. In South Africa, we went to the Social Security Agency, and everybody used to get money in cash from different agents. We converted them all to biometric card systems, voice recognition, iris, and fingerprint. And by the way, 71% of the recipients are women. In a country where 50% of the population is women, something's wrong with that system. But they get this now on a card. Nobody can steal the money that comes to them. Nobody can beat them to take their money. Nobody can harass them to take their money. It's on a damn card with their fingerprint, and you cannot steal my fingerprint.
So just roll back for a second. So you're trying to help women by giving women cards that essentially only they can use, which have money on them.
One, and two, they get an identity. And I tell you, the power of the identity is even more than the power of the card, because the identity means you belong, you get counted, somebody cares about you. The worst thing in the world is no identity. 1.5 billion people out of those two don't have an identity. We take it for granted. You can't do anything. You can't go to vote. You can't go anywhere. That's the idea.
Well, that's fascinating, because I must say most of us do take the fact we have an identity for granted. We spend most of our time in the West worrying about making sure other people don't steal our identities and trying to find ways to protect it. And the idea that one way to help women in the developing world is to give them an identity is fascinating. But Kristalina, why are you working with private sector companies like Mastercard?
The angels, the angels.
Yes, why is the angels working with what used to be viewed as the devils?
Because when you look at the problems in the world that need to be solved, they're so huge that the funding that comes from organizations like ours, the World Bank, dwarfs vis-a-vis these problems. We need trillions to get all children in schools, to get roads that connect men and women to markets. And yet, the development assistance is in the order of 150 billion. So how do we go from billions to trillions? By creating the environment for private sector to be able to invest in developing countries. Today, everywhere in the banks, there is so much liquidity. Actually, in Europe,
well, liquidity is jargon for cash.
Well, there is so much money sleeping in the banks. I was in Europe. The central bank charges negative interest rate. In other words, you pay the bank to keep your money there. And at the same time, in the developing world, there is a huge demand for resources that would bring people to work, would create livable cities. To get that resources there, we, institutions like the bank, we can help countries de-risk their environment. So the perception that, oh, you cannot go in, say, Vietnam, in rural areas, or you cannot go in India massively, that perception can be brought down. So the division of labor is we work on the conditions, the transparency, and then private sector can come in. And then we can get from billions to trillions. And when I'm talking numbers, but what does it mean? Well, that means that women can have their identity in their hands, access to a bank account, and through the bank account, access to microfinance. And then they can live with dignity. We all know that there is no chance for the world to prosper unless we tap in the talent of all its people, men and women. And we know that when it comes to exclusion, women are more likely to be left out.
But
so that is our partnership for good. Yet we actually have a target. Ours is 1 billion people to get in the financial system, and we have Mastercard coming and saying, hey, let's make it 1.5 billion.
Right. But can I... Now, this is fascinating, but at the end of the day, you are not exactly a charity, are you?
No.
You are there to make profit, to make money. I mean, and what you're doing with the World Bank is basically to profit you, isn't it?
So I actually don't make any money out of this today. But I tell you, if you have a perspective of business that operates for 10 and 20 years, my biggest opportunity for growth is to take on cash. Cash is 85% of the world's retail transactions even now. It's inefficient, it's expensive, and it does not create transparency.
And it can easily get in somebody's pocket without the world noticing.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. So to me, that's the biggest opportunity. And by the way, 30% of the cash in the world is generated by governments paying social benefits to their own citizenry, like the South African example. So when we intervened in that, we saved the government of South Africa $350 million on their social security program, plus we found $300 million of fraud money being claimed by people on behalf of people who had died, gone away, did not exist, those kinds of things. That's what I was talking about. If you start with the identity, and I want to clarify one thing on the identity. I'm not interested in having your photograph and your biometrics. That's not my business. That's your government's business. Your government has a social contract with you as the citizen. They should issue you the identity. What I want to do is go into the government's identity database to prove that Kristalina is Kristalina.
Right.
That's what I want to do.
Now, I'm curious, Kristalina, I mean, to what degree is your desire to work with the private sector and to harness or leverage the power of the private sector driven by a recognition that not only are you short of resources to address poverty, but in the current political climate, we're seeing the US government threatening to cut funding, to cut funding to groups like the World Bank. Is that another reason why you're turning to the private sector to help vulnerable women?
We have been looking at private sector solutions for quite some time, and I must admit that sometimes we would get it wrong. Like we would go for in a naive way for privatization without the conditions being in place. But then we found out that if we work with companies in a way that meets their objectives and meets development objectives, and we build this as a partnership to last, then positive change can happen. Just to give you one example, and I'll come back to the funding issue. Mastercard and the World Bank in Lebanon. What do we do together? Well, there are refugees that need to be helped, and they prefer very much that this help is dignified. Because if you go to people and you give them what you think they need, food and shelter, this, one, is not very efficient, but two, not very dignified. When you give them a card and cash, they themselves decide how to use, whether to use it to buy school books or to get a uniform, school uniform for their children. This is dignified. So we need Mastercard to deliver this dignity. But the second thing we did was to say, wait a minute, we are helping the refugees. How about the poor Lebanese? If we don't care about their well-being, there would be a clash. And inevitably, sooner or later, they would say, we don't want these refugees. So what we did was we said to Mastercard, let's expand that and also target the Lebanese population. And the result is we have a very strong program of cooperation in Lebanon, and it helped us to learn how to work with each other in other places. Now, going back to funding, look, I mean, there is no way we can be effective if we concentrate only on governments. And yet, we also need to ask governments to do their part. I'm very proud that at the time of stinginess, we at the World Bank got our biggest increase of funding for the poorest countries. It is called International Development Association. This time, every 3 years, we go around and we say, please, let's put our forces together. Guess what? This year, we got $75 billion. 50% more than 3 years ago. So,
well, you're clearly a good
everybody here who is a taxpayer somewhere, thank you. Right. Thank you.
But can I just come back? I mean, where are the problems of financial inclusion most severe? Because you've been trying to collect data on this in terms of men and women, haven't you?
Well, the very important thing about the bank is that we are a great source of data. So we do an analysis on a country basis and by gender on financial inclusion, among many other things we do. Why is this important? Because it pushes governments to create the conditions for Mastercard and others to lift up inclusion. Today, we measured in 2014, we had 58% of women included, 65% of men. What is very interesting is that this is 10 percentage points more than 3 years ago when we started measuring. So measuring pushes inclusion.
So women are getting more access to financial services?
Well, they are 58%, men are 65%. And by the way, the other thing is, if you look across regions, in East Asia, the difference, this distance between men and women, 4%. In South Asia, so you have a lot of work to do in your part of the world, 18%.
Yeah, I live here.
It is 18%. Well,
there's a problem here too. But
there is a problem here too.
There's a problem here in America, is there? In terms of the gap?
Absolutely.
Just to make the point, I mean, my professor of statistics used to say, you can put your head in the refrigerator, your feet in the oven, your temperature would be average, but you would be dead. So our objective with data is to actually demonstrate that if you pay attention, you can do better, and we create competition among countries as well. Now, I was asking before we got here...
I've never been on a panel with anybody who's managed to make a statistics class sound funny. So congratulations.
One thing, Gillian, on this topic. I'm not speaking only from theory. In these past years, I made a commitment of 500 million people being included. We have reached 300 million, and we are running. We will get past the 500 by 2020.
Yes.
So I've learned real lessons along the way.
That is very true. I mean, in the bank, I was keeping for a punchline on that, but you kind of brought me there.
That's right. We took away your punchline. Give us your punchline.
So my punchline is that on this 1 billion that we have committed to get to, we at the bank said by 2020, 400 million with World Bank, IFC 600 million. And we at the World Bank, the part I'm responsible for, today we are at 390 million already.
Right.
So, what do we do? Do we just say, oh, great, we met our goal? I think, no, we say we raise the bar, we go higher.
Right. Ajay.
So, getting to those 300 plus million that we've got to, we couldn't do it alone. And that's back to your question of what we do together. I think governments create a level playing field and a rule box. And private sector brings ingenuity and capability. And organizations like the World Bank create the railroad that enables this rule box and these regulations to be put into place as best practice around the world. If we do this together, we can make real music out of this orchestra.
Right.
And I think we're beginning to understand that, and we're beginning to do a good job with it. The challenge really remains that the biggest issue is of trust. What I encounter everywhere, despite having reached 300 plus million, is cynicism about why does a private sector company want to do this? Well, you couldn't do it yourself. So if I'm helping you, will you kindly get out of the damn way and start trusting me? Is the kind of the question I ask, because I'm proving it by what I'm doing. If I was merely speaking about it, it would be different. We are putting our money and our effort and our energy where our mouth is.
Right.
And I think that...
Yep.
So to me, this issue of trust is an issue that we have to think about if we're going to get to scalability and sustainability. This conversation 5 years ago would not have happened.
Well, I can agree. I mean, as someone who has covered the financial industry for many, many years and who's paid to be cynical, I can assure you that certainly the language and the language and the tone of conversations from the financial sector has certainly changed in the last few years, partly because there was that terrible financial crisis. But I'm curious, in terms of trying to work together, the private sector and the World Bank, I mean, you do come from very different traditions and cultures. What has been the hardest thing to actually overcome in terms of working together? I mean, you work in a gigantic bureaucracy, don't you?
Not that gigantic. I think we're smaller than Mastercard. But I mean, it is actually the question of, question of trust. It also goes between us. And it took some time. And also the question of language. We may use the same words and we may mean something different. So getting the patience and perseverance to work together and sustain, I mean, we see now each other, every month? That is critical. And what is that drives us to do it? For Mastercard, if the world falls apart, they're not going to have very good business. If fragility deepens, if the refugees in Lebanon cannot be helped, if the women wanting to be entrepreneurs in South Asia do not have access to finance, we are not going to have a very stable global environment. So it is in their interest for development to succeed. And it is in our interest to open up opportunities for people and do it so that it is also dignified. I have never seen people who would like to be on handouts for the rest of their lives. People want to work. And the private sector remains, especially small and medium-sized enterprises, the biggest driver of growth and opportunities.
Right. Ajay, you have 1 minute.
I'll tell you an example of something we did specifically with an institution that's a subsidiary of the World Bank called the International Finance Corporation. We signed a deal with them to extend credit to banks in different parts of the world, where they would then underwrite the risk of that bank getting into the issuing business for financial services. That's been our biggest problem. We're expanding financial services in new countries because we end up taking that risk. We're not experts in understanding the risk in Ghana. They are.
Yeah, exactly.
They now underwrite that risk, and they charge a fee from that bank. And I know that with the World Bank underwriting the risk, I have AAA paper backing me up. I have no risk left any longer. I can go in, they can go in. That's a win-win for both of us.
Right.
But here's the problem. It took us 3 years to get that done. Yeah. And the reason was the magnificent bureaucracy of the World Bank. But I'm just kidding.
Which, before I came there.
Before she came.
Okay. Watch this space.
But the biggest thing was the absence of trust in the beginning. Now it's different.
Right.
It is this trust is the
Well,
biggest.
there is a reason why the word credit comes from the Latin credere, meaning to believe, which is that finance without faith doesn't work.
Can I say something very quickly here?
You have literally 20 seconds.
Yes, they need lower risk, but the people in the countries also want cheaper credit. And this is why we are marrying the objectives of those we serve, those who need development, and those they serve, they call them consumers.
Well, thank you. That's a great note on which to end. And I'll just say one. I'd say one tiny thing, which is that many years ago, before I became a journalist covering finance, I was actually trained as an anthropologist, and I worked in a place called Tajikistan. And the young women I lived with there used to spend a lot of time taking Russian rubles and hiding it in their underwear to make sure that nobody else could steal it. And when I think of a simple thing like digital identity and a little plastic card with a fingerprint or special thing to make sure that you have your money and no one else can take it, it's such a small thing we take for granted, but it's a great symbol of actually empowering women in many ways. So thank you to both of you.
And we will do more of that. Yes.
Thank you.
So now I just have to say, first of all, big thank you to both of you for a very interesting discussion. And secondly, you're now going to take a very brief break, but you have to be back in your seats at noon. So thank you.
Thank you.